I'm very humbled and honored to be here. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to come hear me speak. I really am honored to be here as the lecturer for the Henry Steele Khamadra Lecture, which learning about Mr. Khamadra and preparing for this, I was really struck by some of the things which he espoused many years ago, which seem to me even more relevant today than ever in the current place in American history where we are. The two themes that I really would like to talk about that he really will help me set up is his life. He was not only a historian and a great intellect and an academic, but he was an activist. And he was somebody who believed that it wasn't enough simply to be educated and to know what was happening in the world. It was also the duty and responsibility of those that knew what was going on in the world to advocate. And he wrote many op-eds. He became active in many civil justice and civil rights issues. And that is one of the themes that I'd like to talk to you about today is, you know, where we are today in history. I think we're at a place where we can be educated. We can know what's going on in the world if we really try hard. It's sometimes harder to figure out how to act, but I think there are inspirational folks that we can all learn from, and I think if each one of us in our everyday lives thinks about, in the 100 different choices that we make, how we can make a difference and act out as Americans the values that we espouse, I think each one of us can make a very big difference, and it's even more important now than it's ever been in history, and hopefully I'll explain to you why. The other theme, which I think is really important that Mr. Khamadra espoused, was that America should be a leader not through brute force and by militarism and a sense of might makes right as a powerful nation. We need to lead an exemplary existence in which, you know, he really drew on the thoughts of de Tocqueville in thinking about America as a shining city on a hill where other nations and individuals could use our example as opposed to feeling that America was another imperial power just like all the others that had gone before. And that was something that made us uniquely American, was that we were ascribed to principles that were greater than our own self-interest. The title of this I struggled with, but I think loosely, you know, looking at the Obama administration, the situation of national security and human rights today, you know, it may seem that I'm going to be a little bit harsh on the Obama administration, but only because I think with the increased mandate that he had coming into power and who he was and what he represented and the time in history when he came into power, there was increased responsibility. And thinking about the theme of speaking versus action, I think Obama really exemplifies, in my mind, the basic problem of, even when we know better, sometimes we don't follow through on the things that are difficult to do. Days after his election, as you all probably remember, he vowed to close Guantanamo Bay. I think a lot of us in the civil rights community really breathed a sigh of relief that, okay, we have a constitutional law scholar, a Harvard-educated attorney who has, after all, been an African American, grew up in the United States, and is very well versed in the civil rights history of this country, and was very much elected as being the anti-Bush in the ways that he articulated as, you know, not wanting America to be known as a country that tortures, as a country that indefinitely detains people, and that Guantanamo Bay being a symbol of that it was very important for him to come out on the very first days of his term in office and say that we don't, as a country, we're going to end that chapter, that very dark chapter of our history. And I think a lot of us felt very hopeful. And unfortunately, what happened is I lost some of my best allies at that time because people became very much, in the lead up to that election, the hope, the idea that this was going to be hope. We're going to get behind this man and he's going to save us. He's going to save us from the worst parts of ourselves. If we just get him elected, then all our problems will be solved. And that worked for a little while. I think, people were kind of complacent in the idea that now we had somebody who was saying the right things. Unfortunately, the very same people who had fought some of the most difficult battles and most unpopular battles on behalf of people at Guantanamo went into the Obama administration and then became my opponents and adversaries on the other side very, very quickly. So we had a lot of the best, most powerful, and brightest folks went into the administration, and instead of changing it, they became part of the system. And there have been very, very few examples of people resigning in the Obama administration out of disgust for what has been really a monumental departure from what was promised to us and what got them elected. A lot of these attorneys that I'm talking about that abandoned us made their name solely on being human rights activists for Guantanamo detainees. They had no other, qualifications really, other than they won a big Supreme Court case and were a great, civil rights leader. One of those individuals, I'm thinking of Neil Katyal. He argued on the case on behalf of Salim Hamdan, who was, there was a very famous decision by the Supreme Court, which he won on behalf of a Yemeni, that said that, essentially there could not be an abandonment of the Geneva Conventions entirely. And he won a very good release for Mr. Hamdan, and he became very famous, and he became Assistant Solicitor General. And a couple of years ago, I stood before, not even a couple of years ago, less than a couple of years ago, I stood before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in Washington, D.C., where I argued the exact same thing on behalf of my Yemeni client, who instead of being sent to Guantanamo for torture, had been sent to Bagram for torture. And Neil Katyal stood on the other side and argued that my client had no constitutional rights and should not be given the right to habeas corpus because there's no jurisdiction over Bagram the way there is over Guantanamo. Essentially, the argument is that if we decide, we can choose what rights you have as a human being, as an individual, by the prison location where we send you. So even though my client had never stepped foot in Afghanistan prior to the United States government having kidnapped him from Thailand, sent him to secret prisons in different parts of the world, tortured him. Eventually, after his family had given up and thought he was dead, they got a letter from the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which was the only organization that had access to any detainees, saying, I'm in U.S. military custody. Now, at that point, the government came in and said, well, right now, maybe the Bush administration put him there, but now he's there. So we don't have any, we can't start having adjudications over habeas for people that are in the middle of a war zone. Of course, our argument was he wouldn't be there except for the fact that we transferred him there. That didn't work. I probably didn't get in 2 words during that argument. I mean, I had 3 very high, I say very learned men basically grilling me. I don't think I said 2 words during that, just yelling at me like, Ms. Foster, are you telling us that there's nowhere in the world where we can do this? There's no, if it's not Bagram, where can we do this? Where can we detain people secretly and torture them and do what we need to do without them having habeas corpus? This is a very frustrating argument on your behalf. How can you stand here and make this? I mean, and have somebody like Neil Katyal on the other side to defend that. It made it seem like, God, she's radical. She's crazy. How can she be making this argument? And really, there were. It was just very shocking to me how those same people who were supposedly the freedom fighters had now turned when the power was there, and when there was a self-interest involved, they really turned on us. I think any one of those people could have changed the course of history if they had been willing to stand up and say, not in my name, you're not going to use my credentials, you're not going to do this on my watch. There's just been a failure, I think, of leadership in that regard. And I think one of the lessons we can learn in this election season is don't put all our eggs in that basket. We can't simply elect our leaders and think, he's a good guy, I voted the right way, I'm going to sit back now and if they can't do it, how can I do it? I think each one of us has an individual responsibility and a sphere of influence that we can use. And if we're not willing to sacrifice and to stand up for what's right, we can't expect others to either. I wanted to just go back and talk about who I am and how I mean, there's a lot in the bio there, and I don't want to belabor it, but just to give you an idea of how I came to this work, my family immigrated to the United States from Iran in 1978 during the hostage crisis and the Iranian Revolution. I grew up in a small town in western New York, lived a very, a typical American childhood, I would say, and I eventually went to Cornell Law School and did a brief clerkship at the Court of International Trade, and then was going to go off to a large law firm in New York that paid gazillions of dollars and was really, I thought I have made it, this was what my parents and my, the family of every immigrant wants. We came with nothing, we worked our way up, and, now our daughter went to Cornell and she's gonna work at the biggest law firm, and, it was a little less popular when I decided to give that up, but, that was sort of the American dream, and it was right about, in 2000 I graduated, and then I did my clerkship. And there's something called a bar trip, which attorneys sometimes do after you graduate and take the bar. Then you go off for some vacation for a really long time and come back and then start the real work. And it was in between my clerkship and my starting at this law firm that I decided I would take my bar trip, and I decided to go to Africa for 3 months. I was going to climb Kilimanjaro, I was going to travel around and backpack around, and I was planning to leave on September 11th, 2001. And that's when I had bought my ticket. My house at the time, my apartment where I was living, about 5 blocks south of Ground Zero. And of course, that morning, after the events of that morning, the airport was closed. I couldn't leave. I was supposed to leave at noon. Got delayed, was there for a week during all of this. And I said, well, now my building, even though it had not been structurally damaged, it was condemned because there was so much debris and dust and everything in the building that it was uninhabitable for at least 2 or 3 months. So I was like, well, then I might as well just go to Africa and do my thing. I will never forget touching down in Nairobi, and when people found out that I was American, the outpouring of support, no matter where you went, you could be there were some places I went where nobody had heard of what had happened. They were very, very remote. But anyone who had heard about 9/11 or had heard about the attacks, we're with you. We support you. We are, we can't believe that people would do this to our beloved, America. And really, not to say that America had a perfect image amongst, in the world before 9/11, but clearly at that moment in our history, we had an opportunity to really unify the world in support of anything that we did. Unfortunately, I think it didn't take us very long to squander that opportunity because, within a few years, then it became a much more hostile experience to travel the world than it was at that time. But I remember people being very, very supportive at that time. And in fact, one thing that we, I think is a little known fact is one of the first countries that condemned the attacks after 9/11 and called for, regardless of political ideology, support for the United States in their time of need was Iran. And I think it would be I think it's very interesting if you read the papers today and look at what's going on. Do we feel that we want to, the course that we're going to take at this point, are we really making progress or making our problems worse? And I think the discourse that's happened recently about Iran is very ominous because it really does harken back to the kind of discourse that happened before the Iraq War. The making of enemies has sort of become a part of American politics. everyone needs a good enemy. Everyone needs a good threat to get the people rallied behind. It's the same tactic, in fact, that the Iranian government uses in its own country, because the only thing that keeps the Iranians in power, the ones that oppress their own people, is you need us because look at the Americans. They're going to come in here and take over this country if we're not here. So the political choices that we make are oftentimes more complicating and less alleviating of the ills that we're trying to address. When I came back and started at my law firm, I was doing securities litigation, white-collar criminal defense. I was representing people who, they were people in the Enron scandal, and it was like, the people that had, stolen lots of money, and, people would say, oh, how can you represent those people, but nothing compared to when I started representing Guantanamo detainees, and then everyone was like, oh my God, now you've really gone over the deep end. Now you've gone from representing Wall Street crooks to Guantanamo detainees, the worst of the worst. I was doing it pro bono at my law firm, and I was lucky that my law firm was one of the largest in the world, so could take that sort of a political risk to, take on a detainee case at the time when, George Bush was saying, these are the worst of the worst. These are the people that caused 9/11, and nobody knew who they were. And so it was one of the very first law firms that took on the cases. There was only a handful of us. And I represented 3 men from France who were, most of the early cases that we took on were on behalf of Europeans that had been at Guantanamo. The British detainees, there were French, I think there were some Germans, there were a number of European folks, and there was a conscious decision to bring those cases first, because who wants to, take on a case on behalf of a Saudi, or, it was like these were the ones that could sell. So these were the cases that were brought first, and very quickly on, the government learned that it's not popular to have British people in detention. It's not popular, you got the French all up in arms about this is not good. So very quickly, the folks that we had strong relationships, and there was allies, and there were people in those communities that were willing to say, this is wrong and this is an injustice, those folks were released sort of in the first wave. The rest of who remained at Guantanamo was really a mystery. The US government never gave us the names of anybody that was there, and in fact maintained that the identities and the nationalities of those individuals was classified information. Who we are holding in our prison is classified information that nobody is entitled to know. That caused basically, years and years of delay for people not even having, if you didn't have a family member and you were hidden from the ICRC when the people that were there that were supposed to make sure that the United States was not abusing prisoners and that had registered everybody with the ICRC, when they would come around, detainees were hidden so that nobody would ever find out where they were. That's a practice that has been documented and continues to this day. There are people that are being held in our custody off the books. And it became very obvious that there were 2 reasons for that. One was, A, we weren't really that organized, and we didn't really know why we were holding a lot of these people. Somebody had the wrong name, and then the second one is it was embarrassing. I mean, we had a lot of people who had been horribly tortured and abused that nobody wanted to own up to having made that kind of a mistake. And I'm not suggesting to any of you that this was done deliberately, to harm people, that people were taken into custody with the idea that we're going to torture innocent people. No, that's not the way it was. But when you write the executive a blank check and say, you do what you need to do to keep us safe, and we're not going to ask too many questions, that's the inevitable result. So when I got to CCR, the first day that I got there, I decided, well, I should say, just like Buzz, most of the attorneys that came on board, like myself in the early days, were so outraged and, just by the outrageous positions that the government was taking in the cases, that they quickly became completely consumed in the Guantanamo work and almost didn't work on anything else because it felt very difficult to go to work and argue about such and such legal procedure or tenet of the law when, at the same time, if the executive decides to just take that part of the Constitution out or ignore it, that just flies. I mean, you sort of feel like a hypocrite working in one legal system that applies to one set of folks and another that applies, you know, to unpopular people. And I was really in the midst of two legal systems, because here I had these guys that were accused of stealing a whole bunch of money on, you know, Wall Street, figuratively, I would say. And then, you know, these Guantanamo folks, and I was dealing with the same Department of Justice, but in one case, the Department of Justice was speaking, you know, okay, well, your client has been charged and da-da-da, and the rights and the, you know, the way they would never stray from those principles that they felt were really like, that's what makes us lawyers, that's what makes us a civilized society, this is the rule of law. On the other side, it was like just completely mind-boggling positions that we were taking, you know. They don't have any human rights, they're not in US custody, who cares if we tortured them, who cares if they can't talk to you, everything they say is classified, this is gonna hurt national security for even file a case. You know, these were the positions that they were taking, and I think there were a lot of lawyers that felt, that struggled with that in the early days of DOJ. Unfortunately, now it's become somewhat entrenched, and those positions continue. The Department of Justice is very much the same as it was in the early days after 9/11. I don't usually write these out on cards, but I said, you better bring cards, because that makes it look really, so I wrote them out on cards, but now I can't find out where I am in the cards. So I think, you know, one of the things that I think, oh, I know where I was. This is where I was. So I got to CCR. I decided I'm going to leave my job, you know, my cushy law firm job, and I'm going to go volunteer at CCR for a while and see what they need help with. And I remember walking in the door, and here I was coming from this like state-of-the-art law firm where I had someone, I was like, oh, my pen doesn't work, and 5 people would jump up and be like, oh, Ms. Foster, here's a pen, you know. And now I was here, I walk into CCR, and you know, there's like gum on the floor, and, you know, the place is falling apart, like it just looks abysmal, and I'm like, I'm coming to work here, you know. But then I thought to myself, well, if these people, you know, won this case with these resources, imagine what they could do if they had the kind of resources that we had over at the law firm. And I got there and I said, well, what do you guys need help with? And they said, well, here's a box. A box was given to me, and in the box was a whole bunch of letters in different languages from all over the world saying, I think my son might be in Guantanamo, but I'm not sure. Here's a letter from the ICRC. I heard you guys had a case in the Supreme Court and you won. Please, please help. There's nobody else. And I had this group, and I said, okay, well, here's what I can do. You know, we had 2 attorneys at CCR that could have possibly worked on the thing at the time, totally, you know, outstaffed on the Justice Department side, and only a handful of law firms and a few folks that were like Buzz and others who were really, you know, were going to stand up for what was right, but most people didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. We didn't know who these people were. And so what I did is I just started calling all of my friends at law firms that were at different law firms and pitching it to their pro bono department. I remember when I started, nobody wanted to touch it. You know, it was like, what are our clients are going to say? You're representing this Saudi guy that's been accused of, you know, he hasn't been accused of anything, but who knows what he's going to be accused of? He could be the guy that did the whole thing. Why are our firm going to put our name on the line to do that? Well, you know, by the end of it, through, you know, just plugging through, eventually I got to the end of that stack, and all of those people had representation. And by the end of it, the second summer that I was there, every law firm in New York City wanted a Guantanamo detainee, because they didn't want to be the one that, you know, all the law students were coming out of law school and say, oh, well, we heard about the sexy Guantanamo litigation, and do you guys have one of those cases? And it was really, you know, not in vogue to not have one. So, you know, I had bankruptcy attorneys from Bingham McCutcheon calling me and saying, how come our firm didn't get a case? And da-da-da. It just completely changed. So, you know, when you think of, I mean, that's not the sexiest job. I wasn't the first person to go down to Guantanamo. I wasn't in court, you know, on their behalf, but most of those people are still very much involved in the movement, and it brought a lot of big private money to the cause that really, really made a difference in a way that DOJ had to take them seriously, because it wasn't just a few radical lawyers. Now it was like the whole bar is involved in this issue, and we have to take it seriously. So what I'm saying, my point is, for the students in the audience, sometimes, you know, the biggest it may be your dream and your passion to be a human rights lawyer or, to be an activist or a humanitarian. Sometimes the best way to get to that point is just see what needs to be done. And maybe it's not the most glamorous job in the world, but you start there and you end up, with a whole bunch of opportunities if you open your eyes. What happened to me at the end of this box was we had only a handful of people represented. There were still more than 500 people there. We had no idea who they were. We tried to sue to get their names. We tried to put the word out. No idea who's there. Government maintains this classified information. So I end up traveling to Bahrain and Afghanistan and Yemen and, basically stand outside the Human Rights Organization and say, hey, I'm here. If I'm willing to provide legal advice to anybody whose family members in Guantanamo, come see us. And outpourings of people came, not only people that were at Guantanamo, but a lot of people that were in other places, and a lot of people that were missing. A lot of people we found out were no longer around. A lot of people, turns out, were at Bagram, not Guantanamo, and that was the dirty little secret that nobody really talked about, was that before Guantanamo, there was Bagram in Afghanistan where, most of the horrible torture that you hear about that happened to the Guantanamo detainees often happened prior to them getting to Guantanamo, while they were in CIA black sites, while they were at Bagram. There are documented Army investigations that have confirmed the deaths of people that were tortured to death at Bagram, who were later found to be innocent. There's a documentary called Taxi to the Dark Side about one of those deaths. I recommend it. In any event, this was, it was sort of we had become somewhat a victim of our own success because we had this movement of attorneys that were talking about Guantanamo, but then meanwhile, it was becoming larger than life because there was all of this other stuff still going on, and Guantanamo was just the tip of the iceberg. I came back to CCR after, a couple of years of doing this. We finally got critical mass, and pretty much everybody at Guantanamo, by the end of the time that I was there, had representation if they wanted it. Family members had contact with lawyers if they wanted it. And I felt like that movement was on its way. But I also felt that from the personal conversation, on a very personal level, of sitting across from a mother of somebody who said, oh, Ms. Foster, thank you very much for meeting with me, but my son's at Bagram, not Guantanamo. Are you telling me that there's no organization that's going to help just because the U.S. decided to send? And literally, there were times where one brother was at Guantanamo and the other one was at Bagram. You don't get legal help for those people. This seems like kind of an arbitrary thing. And I didn't have a good answer for that question. So when I came back, I felt personally responsible to having an answer to that question. And even if the answer to that question is, nobody wants to help you, no organization will take it. But as it turned out, I tried a lot of organizations. I tried to pitch it to some of the usual suspects, and people felt that they had their hands full with Guantanamo. That was like even more work that, we hadn't won the first battle. So that's when I decided that I didn't want to go back and say, nobody wants to take your case, because I personally felt on the hook. And so I said I have to try. And that's when I started IJN, and a very courageous group of people who believed in me helped and started, and Buzz was the first and still is founding chairman of the board of the International Justice Network, which has since 2006 been the only organization that has fought for the rights of people at Bagram, and now we've represented 30 or 40 people who have been released as a result of our efforts. None of them have been released through courts because the courts have not taken these cases. I should talk about that. In the very first case that we filed was on behalf of the client, Fadi al-Makaleh, who I told you was the Yemeni man who was on a business trip to Thailand and was taken by the CIA, taken to Bagram. I told you the colloquy that I had between Neil Katyal, the Assistant Solicitor General, and myself in front of the Court of Appeals. Well, how that case came to the Court of Appeals was we brought it originally in district court, and it was assigned to a George W. Bush appointed judge, Judge John Bates, who is very conservative, but also has a reputation of being a learned judge. And he had, like many of the district court judges in D.C., had seen the Guantanamo habeas cases and had seen a lot of the classified evidence that was really just, once you saw that the emperor had no clothes, a lot of those judges actually turned turned around and said, you know what, we're giving way too much deference to the government here. These are serious, serious cases, and the judiciary has a role. Judge Bates looked at the case that we brought and said, you know what, well, I should back up. The case was brought under the Bush administration, and we were before Judge Bates. The government had briefed the case and had argued under the Bush administration that because these people were being held outside of the United States in Guantanamo, there was no right to habeas. The Constitution didn't apply. There's no human rights enforceable in a United States court of law. We don't care that there's no other court of law that they can go to. They can't come here. And when Obama made that speech and came into office, the case was pending, Judge Bates wrote sua sponte, not on our, meaning not that we asked for it, on his own, basically sent a note to the Department of Justice and obviously CC'd us on it and said, well, maybe in light of this speech, you would like to refine your position on this case. And we were all waiting for that, like, oh, good, we're done. I'm going to go back to do something else. Like, this is going to be over. We're not going to have, this isn't going to be difficult. And what happened? A one-sentence reply that said we adhere to our previously stated position. Period. That was it. And that has been the way it has gone. And that is, Judge Bates, to his credit, looked at the Supreme Court decision that came out, Boumediene, which came out in 2006, that granted the Guantanamo detainees the right to habeas corpus, and said, look, these people are being held 100% in our custody. We're responsible for them. We brought them there. And he said, these people at Bagram are no different, at least with respect to those people that we brought from outside of Afghanistan into this conflict zone. We are not allowed to rely on that as the sole reason that we're going to deny them habeas corpus. And he said that the decision should apply, and he granted our clients a right to habeas. Before we were able to get into any of the merits and argue our client's innocence, the Obama administration came in and said, we're going to appeal this decision because we can't let this stand. We don't want to give people the right to habeas corpus everywhere in the world, even if they're in our sole custody and we brought them into a conflict zone. We have to draw the line somewhere, and the line stops at U.S. citizenship and U.S. borders. The rest of the world be damned. That was a position that continues to be the position to this day. They are still defending the right to hold our clients without charge indefinitely. My client, Fadi Al-Makla, that I mentioned, has been at Guantanamo for 10 years now, never been charged with a crime. His children, he hasn't seen in 10 years. They've grown up, not allowed a family visit. And Buzz, actually, you misspoke. I've never been to Guantanamo. None of the people at Guantanamo have ever met with a lawyer. I go to Bagram in Afghanistan. I can go to the village surrounding. I can walk right up to the door of the military base. But because I'm an attorney representing a detainee, it's not safe to let me in. And probably it's not. Because, when attorneys came to Guantanamo, what did they do? They talked about the things that they saw to the extent that they could. I mean, the government tried very, very hard and still does. I'm sure Buzz could tell you a lot more if he didn't have the restrictions that are placed on attorneys at Guantanamo. But even that, even with those restrictions, that kind of turned the tide, because then there were human beings, and there was a face-to-face, an attorney and a client, and that really, I think, changed people's minds in a lot of ways about Guantanamo. Well, with Bagram, they've managed to keep us out. Still have not, these cases that I argued in U.S. courts, my clients have no idea that I argued them. I have recently learned that I've become popular and a name in Bagram because it came out, over the years of doing this, that there was this lawyer, Tina Foster, and she's been filing habeas petitions, and some of these people have been released. So, I got a few calls from families that said, I got a phone call from Bagram. They started phone calls recently. And they said, my son said to call you. So I started getting clients that way. And then what happened very interestingly is a colleague called and said, Tina, another organization had started to work on these cases and called and said, our client says that they met with you at Bagram and you told them that you won't represent them because our organization represents them, and that, after you got all the information from them, you left the room and said you wouldn't represent them. And I said, I've never been to Bagram. you know. And as it turns out, there's a doppelganger. There's somebody that dresses up and is, hi, I'm Tina Foster, and why don't you tell me all about your case? I'll be your lawyer. And, you know, and tells them at the end of the day, thanks very much, I'm not going to represent you, and leaves. And these people thought it was really me, you know. You thought it was really me. So you can imagine the kind of things that go on there. You know, the fact of the matter, I mean, the courts know about it. The idea that, you know, people, there's nothing else I could say to outrage people at this point. I mean, judge knows that. A judge knows that you went in and, you know, that the other side went and impersonated you to your client. What other, you know, in what world would that be accepted in a civilized justice system? I mean, you can't talk to your client, the other says you can't talk to them, and they're going to send somebody else to pretend that they're you and get all the information. I mean, it's a sad state of affairs. That being said, I went through all of this on my own. I'm so proud. Oh, yes, I was going to take questions. So I should take questions now. And I'll look and see if there's anything really important that I forgot to say. But, I mean, I think you get the point that my message really here is that actions are not, words are not enough. We have to follow through on our basic principles that we, you know, as Americans, that we claim define ourselves, even when it's hard. Because where we are in history is not making us any safer. This is really the decline of the United States in the eyes of the world. And when I started this, when I would go abroad and meet with a family member of somebody in U.S. custody, they would say to me, thank God they're in U.S. custody. He's innocent. He's going to get a trial. He won't be tortured. He'll be released eventually. They'll eventually get it right. Nobody says that anymore. Nobody says that anymore. And in fact, the situation is quite the opposite. Oh, he's in U.S. custody. Okay, yeah, whatever. You're an American lawyer. What can you do for me? I'd rather go, you know, you're not going to get results. So if you don't give people a legal means to fight for their rights, what do you leave them with? So you're basically creating a situation where might makes right. So if the only choice that someone has is, I either can, you know, accept that I'm going to be, you know, my son, this person from my village is going to be indefinitely detained, and the United States government can come and drop drones on us and can do all of that. And someone else comes to you and says, hey, join up with us and fight against the United States for your freedoms. And instead, your other option is some inept lawyer from the United States coming and say, here, you can file a totally useless habeas corpus action and we can fight in the American justice system. Your choices become very, you know, weighted towards one side when you feel that there's no other option. And so what I think the point here that I'm trying to get across is that it only hurts us by not doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, because for every one person that, you know, we may have decided was a dangerous person that should have been put away, we've created hundreds, villages, people all over the world who really do not trust anything that the United States government says, especially after Obama, especially after the Cairo speech and all of the things that have happened since. And we are going to have to do a lot as Americans, as individuals, to reclaim some of that, I won't say moral high ground because it sounds sort of superior, but, you know, at least a place to advocate for human rights and to advocate for a better world and a safer world without, you know, appearing to be complete hypocrites. So, you know, that's the place that we're in, and I think that there's things that each of us can do. The trips that I've been on with Buzz and the other attorneys, most instances, these attorneys were the first Americans that the individual family members had ever met, and they said, you know, and that did something to help, because those people were like, okay, well, maybe your system is broken and maybe your government stinks and maybe most of the people in your country, you know, don't care, but at least there's a couple good ones. And you know, when they go back to their village, they say, well, not all Americans are horrible. You know, there's a couple of them that came and they tried really hard and they came all the way to Bahrain and they spent their own money to represent people that they don't know, that makes a difference. And that's why I say that each one of us has a responsibility to do what we can. Yeah, I'll take the questions.
I was wondering, so what can we do, or we do as non-lawyers or people who don't have much authority? What can we do either locally or to work with people like us in government?
I think that's a really, really important question. And I think, the first thing I think is to give of your time and of your voice, to call your leaders to account, to make sure that in this election season that these are issues, human rights, civil rights are issues. You don't just send your local representative to government to represent your local interests, that you also demand that they are going to keep these promises and that there will be consequences. And I think expressing dissatisfaction and calling them to account is important. But I think also, it's going to take people, making sacrifices of their time. And if you don't have time, then you probably have money, And if you have money, don't give it to don't pay all that money in taxes to the U.S. government. Give it to a human rights organization that's going to. There's a lot of them here. My organization, International Justice Network, you can get, every $25 makes a huge difference. So even if you're not a person of means, you can do that. There's organizations like No More Guantanamos that were started by people who are here who have taken it upon themselves to organize. They do great work. I think that each one of us has to participate. And as long as we are, in whatever means we can, involved and stay active in these issues, whether it's organizing street demonstrations or petitions. There's so many great organizations that have taken up these causes. Just, you don't need to look very far to get involved. And so I would encourage everybody to do that. And most of the people that are involved in the movement at this point are obviously non-lawyers, so there's plenty to be done. Yeah, I think the question was what has been the United States' role in promoting human rights in the Arab Spring and its aftermath. And, unfortunately, I think at this point there's not much role that we can or should play because we are not the shining city on the hill. That, I don't think that we have the standing really to interfere because we haven't gotten our own house in order. That being said, it's very easy to say, well, shouldn't we do something to help these people? Well, let's do something to help ourselves first. That's been my view, is that we should be leading by example. We should have the best. We should strive to have a justice system that can withstand fear of terrorism. That, right now what we're doing is we're militarizing our justice system so that we're taking away the power of the federal courts and moving them into the military by having military commissions, by having indefinite detention and that sort of thing. The Arab world, when we're taking that approach, and the Arab world is taking the opposite approach of demilitarization and trying to establish civil societies, I feel like we really can't go there and say this is what you do in the year 2011 to guarantee people basic civil freedoms, when what we're doing is passing laws that say our judges and our Constitution and our civil freedoms really are ineffective in today's day. Those are antiquated ideas. Now we have the threat of terrorism. So my view would be what we could do is really strengthen our traditional legal systems and have, I know a lot, the former judge that I used to work for goes and speaks a lot in different venues and works with emerging democracies all over the world. And those kind of exchanges on a one-to-one level work much better than a systematic or top-down approach. But we have to have some good examples. And when our best examples are few and far between, it's very difficult to put ourselves out as leader. And I haven't seen much that would give me hope in that regard, and I almost feel scared to ask for it.
I thought I read where the Obama administration won't close Guantanamo because there's no country that will take those people. Is there any truth to that?
No, there are there were in the beginning countries that said, we're not going to take them if you're not going to take them in the United States. But since then, other countries have taken them. And in fact, you know, that's an excuse. It's just an excuse because in the situations of my clients, I've got letters from countries saying, we'll take them. And they're still sitting there. So, you know, in my view, that's really an excuse. And frankly, if we've kept somebody for 10 years wrongly, you know, do we not have a responsibility to resettle them, to find a place for them, even if it means inviting them into our country? And I think, you know, there's a lot of great organizations that have worked on trying to get local groups in the United States to say, we're willing to take on detainees. We're willing to have somebody here in our community. We're not scared by the stigma of Guantanamo. And if this person is was an upstanding member of his society and he can't go back there because what we've done to him, it's our responsibility as Americans to rectify that. And I think that's the least we can do. We're not paying anybody reparations for the torture. We're not, you know, we're not compensating people for the 10 years of their lives that they lost as a result of stupid mistakes. And the least that we could do is guarantee their safety.
Did you ever sort of play on the devil's advocate role, or did you only represent people that you felt were?
Oh, you know, there's no, well, my job's kind of easy because none of my clients are charged with anything, so I don't have to make a determination about whether or not they're innocent or guilty. They're all innocent of, you know, whatever crime they've been charged with because they haven't been charged with anything, you know. So it's not, you know, it's not that difficult because the point at which any of these people got a habeas hearing to determine whether or not they were guilty or innocent would be a huge victory. You know, when we started out this, when we didn't know that most of the people at Guantanamo were innocent people, when we thought maybe they really are 500 bad people there, we still took on those cases. And a lot of people said, well, you know what, Tina, we'll take this case, but if it turns out this guy's a bad guy, we're just going to argue for the right to habeas, and then someone else can represent him, because we don't really want our firm to be representing somebody that's going to stand up and say, yes, I did it, you know, I'm a bad guy. And we said, that's fine. You know, what we're saying is charge our clients. Like, you know, at the end of the day, it was like, we just want our day in court. You know, we just want, and if you're a lawyer that has a problem representing somebody who you know, don't agree with, then there's plenty of lawyers who do that all of the time. So it wasn't really a stretch for most people because, as I said, they made it kind of easy in the fact that nobody had been charged with anything to begin with. Then, of course, later on, when Guantanamo became very prominent as a rallying cry for social justice movements, they actually did move people that they had in secret CIA detention, Khaled Sheikh Mohammed, and people who were voicing anti-American sentiment and had said and admitted to, you know, to doing harmful acts against the United States. They brought them to Guantanamo after the fact. Those were the only people that have been brought to Guantanamo because they didn't want it to be full of goat herders and people who had nothing to do with anything. They had to say, at least we've got some bad guys there. So they brought them in sort of after the fact, and now they do have people who claim to be bad guys. It's not about guilt or innocence anyway. It's really about our system and about, you know, what we believe in and the response to 9/11 rather than being, you know, we have down at Ground Zero, Buzz could tell you now everything's named Liberty Plaza and Freedom this and Patriot that, you know. Wouldn't it have been great if we could actually have done that, you know, if we could have actually meant it? We just named them those things, and instead of when, you know, being attacked, we didn't do what we should have done, which was, you know, become even stronger as Americans and say, our justice system cannot be, you know, I get to go to these panels and I get all these folks are saying, you know, you're criticizing the response to 9/11. What should we have done? We should have done something. Why should it be that some bad guys did something to us and we have to change our entire way of life and our system? That's defeat in my mind. So that's what I have to